decisive.
This week we're going to discuss the issues of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, which has been in the forefront of the news in a way that it's never been before. Relations between the two countries are strained due to a number of factors, including oil prices, the Iran deal, and congressional efforts related to 9/11. Joining me to discuss these issues is Hussein Ibish. He's senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, a weekly columnist for the UAE newspaper The National, and a regular contributor to several U.S. and Middle East publications. Thanks for joining me, Hussein.
You're very welcome. I'm delighted.
You know, the relationship has always just been there, kind of below the surface. It wasn't talked about much, except in times of crisis. This seems to be one of those. There are several factors. I didn't mention one in the intro, and that was the interview that the president gave, a series of interviews that were put together by Jeffrey Goldberg in something called the Obama Doctrine.
Right.
I want to look at, I'm just going to put up a number of the quotes, and then I just want to talk about the whole thing. The first is a quote from Jeffrey. These are quotes directly attributed to the president, and let's start with the first one. All I need in the Middle East are a few smart autocrats. And then, when asked by Malcolm Turnbull from Australia about his, this is a different one, you've got a number of countries calling for action, pushing us to act, but then showing an unwillingness to put any skin in the game, and he calls them free riders and says they aggravate me. And then there's this interview with Malcolm Turnbull, where he says, Turnbull says, aren't the Saudis your friends? And the president says, it's complicated. And finally, this may be the most disturbing of them all. He makes a comparison between Arabs and people in Southeast Asia. And he says, contrast the Middle East with Southeast Asia, which still has huge problems, but is filled with striving, ambitious, energetic people. The contrast is pretty stark. They're not thinking about how to kill Americans. What they're thinking about is, how do I get a better education? How do I create something of value?
Right.
I have two questions. The first is, what the heck was he thinking of? And the second is, will this be his legacy? For the president who started in Cairo, does the trajectory go from Cairo to Goldberg? And is this what we're left with in terms of the president and the Middle East? Let me start with the first one.
Those are great
questions. You ever seen a president during his tenure say things like this for the record?
I don't think we have. And there's one very incendiary comment from the same article that that you didn't highlight that's worth mentioning, where he said that Saudi Arabia and the other American Gulf partners, Arab partners, need to share, that was the word he used, the Middle East with Iran. It didn't qualify it in any other way. That hit as hard as anything else in the Gulf. Have we seen this before? No, I don't think so. I think the tradition has been for American presidents that have opinions that are, number one, very incendiary and do cause diplomatic problems, predictable, inevitably cause diplomatic problems with partners and allies and whatnot, to wait until at least the interregnum between the election and the new inauguration, the next president coming in, if not entirely until after office, to say these things because of the inevitable diplomatic blowback to the country. We haven't seen that before. The other thing is that we've certainly seen presidents trying to define their policy legacies, but not in a way that has been so starkly at odds with American policy practice and American policy documents. And a lot of what he said that you highlighted here is not reflected in the practice of his administration, nor is it to be found in the policy documents. In other words, these are his personal views. These are his opinions. There's no one whose opinion is more important in shaping U.S. policy than the president's. But the president's opinion is not the same as policy. Now, I think many Americans understand that, but believe me, it's hard to explain that in the Middle East. I was in the Gulf a couple of weeks ago, making this case time and again that there's a distinction between U.S. policy, both in theory and in practice, and Mr. Obama's opinions, and there's overlaps, but there are also distinctions. it was hard to grasp that. I also asked Goldberg what the president was hoping to achieve, just to answer that question. Because I had him on a panel with me yesterday, and we specifically talked about this. And I'm persuaded by what he said, and it's what I would have imagined too, that he's trying aggressively to define his legacy. And he just wants to get the jump on everybody else. And it's not necessarily entirely selfish or irresponsible, because if you assume, as he probably thinks, that he has the correct prescription, the correct formula for American foreign policy, then it's almost let's say, a responsibility to help to clarify exactly what that is and give it the best shot of being continued by the next administration, rather than an irresponsible act to kind of vent his personal views, which is how one might see it otherwise.
When I was reading the piece, what occurred to me was, if I start at Cairo and I end up with here, what it appeared to me the president was doing was saying, I failed, I give up, and it's their fault.
Yes.
That seemed to be the gist of it. And so an effort, maybe on the part of Goldberg, not so much the president, to create a coherency out of this, to put it together into a doctrine, but it's a doctrine that is an apologia, but it's not so much a proactive doctrine as much as it is explaining why this didn't work.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, there's a couple things to be said. First, there is a trajectory, clearly, between Cairo and the Obama doctrine, and or let's say his visit to Saudi Arabia to meet with the GCC leaders.
I'll talk about that in a minute.
So there's a trajectory between then and now. Let's put it that way. And the trajectory is largely, as you say, one of failure. So you have the president coming in with a very ambitious agenda of transformation, of changing the nature of the relationship. He couldn't do it. That really characterized the first term. I think the second term became a lot less ambitious, more focused. Focused specifically. Oh, well, let's pull back. Even the first term, after the Cairo speech, the idea of transforming the relationship with the Middle East, with the Arab world and Iran, it was really focused on two agenda items: Israel-Palestinian peace, which is a total failure, and outreach to Iran, which I think the president believes was a relative success, and clearly, and I think with some justification. But overall, I think there is a sense that American ambitions and policy goals were not reached, and he certainly blames others for it. I think there's no question about that. Yeah.
The issue, the last part, comparing the Middle East with Southeast Asia, Dubai,
yes,
and today Riyadh,
right,
which is incubating small, middle-sized enterprises and promoting entrepreneurialism, and ignoring the real history of Indonesia and real. It's almost as if it was designed to be provocative.
It does come across that way. It is a caricature of the reality, and it's an unfair one. There's no question. Now, on the positive side, saying nice things about East Asia and Southeast Asia includes a lot of Muslims, so that it becomes very hard to read any Islamophobic attitude into the president's remarks, which is not surprising. Obama has never been guilty of that, and no one could really think that. But it's nice to be reminded. But what it does is it again raises the question of, does Obama have a problem with Arabs? And does he have any kind of a personal dislike? And I think the jury's out on that, frankly. There's every reason to wonder about it. And specifically, I would say it's not just this irrational contrast of good, constructive, purposive, industrious Southeast Asians versus, fanatical and unproductive, destructive, in fact, Arabs that he paints. But also, his contrast, or rather the double standard that he has expressed on things like democracy and human rights and women's rights and patriarchy and misogyny, where he's been very harsh on Arab states about that, and it does not seem to apply those same standards to Iran. Now, you could say, well, we expect our we ask more of our allies. That would be, I think, the plausible response to this. But I think what it does suggest is that he's very willing to cast a critical eye on the Arab world and see it in largely negative terms, and not to do that when it comes to East Asia, Southeast Asia, or Iran.
Let me just, on the one issue you mentioned as the most provocative, I want to take issue with it for a moment, because actually, in a very basic sense, the president is right. At the end of the day, Iran and the Gulf states have to be able to share that region.
Oh, sure.
The question is, has he laid the predicate for that? Jesse Jackson used to say, if you excite one side and incite the other, you're asking for trouble. And in this instance, the question is, while reaching out to the one side, has he taken into consideration how to build the confidence of the other? And I think that therein lies the dilemma. At the end of the day, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, Bahrain, all of them are an arena of conflict that can only be resolved by the two sides ultimately finding a way to coexist.
Well, I think the problem is the word share. That's the problem, is that it's such a vague word, and it implies a degree of equity that perhaps doesn't make sense in terms of incentive structures. Now, had he said that neither Iran nor the Arabs are going away, they have to learn to live together, they need a modus vivendi, there needs to be a new constructive relationship, a security architecture, an economic relationship, I think everyone would have said fine, and that's reasonable. The thing is, he used the word share in a way that seemed to equate the agendas of the Arab states and Iran as equally legitimate. And the problem is twofold. Number one, that Iran disagrees with and opposes American policy goals in the region, at least something like 90%. I mean, the only place where there are some tactical agreements in Syria and Iraq vis-a-vis Daesh and some other things, and in Afghanistan, these are almost coincidental, frankly. And of course, there's the nuclear agreement, where there's a common agenda pursuant to that deal. But beyond that, it seems to me, there's almost entirely a disagreement between Tehran and Washington, which is the opposite when it comes to the Arab Gulf partners of Washington, which seem to me to agree with American long-term strategic goals. Whether they have different reasons or not is not the point. Where they want to go is the same place. And the other thing is that this is where I think it alienates Arab partners of the United States, is that they would ask the question, well, if it's simply a matter of now we go back to, sort of zero position, where we have to equally share in a kind of completely equitable way everything with Iran. What is the virtue of having been an ally of the United States for many decades? And what's the cost of having opposed the United States and continuing to oppose the United States across the board, and having supported terrorist movements and actually attacked American interests and things like that? What kind of incentive structure is this? Where do they pay a penalty, and where do we get the benefit if it all comes back to we just have to share? I think the word was loaded in a way that seemed to disregard the alliance and the partnership, and that's what sticks.
Two other issues that came up very recently, but also stuck in the craw and prefigured the visit of the president. One is the call to release the 9/11 28 pages. And the other is a congressional bill to allow U.S. citizens to sue Saudi Arabia for 9/11. Talk a little about both and what they mean in terms of the relationship.
Let me add a third, just for fun. There is also a senatorial initiative in the Senate to attempt to limit arms sales to Saudi Arabia in the context of the Yemen war. Now, that's a little different than the two 9/11 things.
I would talk about that in a moment, because that bill is not one that I would call into question, the Murphy bill, as much as I would suggest that it is largely based on existing U.S. law,
right,
but ought to be applied to every country, including ourselves,
right,
and not just singling out one.
Right.
Okay, but talk about the
let's talk about the other 9/11 thing. Yeah, well, the 28 pages is interesting because the Saudis have asked for it to be released in the past. I mean, they have an ambivalent relationship with these 28 pages. On the one hand, they have requested its release. On the other hand, they clearly don't like the idea of it being released in this way at this time under these circumstances, because it seems, I think, to them to be an effort to sort of squash the progress that's been made in healing the relationship, even though it's been sort of limited progress, but it's there. And so the question gets raised, why would people be doing this now? It's been out there for a long time. The Saudis have asked for it to be released in the past. What's the purpose of this bill and the other bill? Where does this initiative come from? Why, when the United States is implementing the agreement with Iran and has managed to secure Arab support for that, and has now turned its attention from the Obama visit to Saudi Arabia and other things to repairing frayed trust with the Arab states, why bring this up now? I think that's the question. And so the issue is, I think, ultimately not going to be the release of the 28 pages or not, because as far as we can tell from people who've read it, it seems to be based on unverified, unvetted intelligence information that's really not terribly credible. And my suspicion is it's going to be interpreted differently by different people.
Let's go to the summit. The president went to the GCC summit in the context of all of these developments. Number one, was it positive? Number two, what were outcomes that you can point to?
Yeah, it was positive in a limited way, which is what one had anticipated. No dramatic breakthrough. For example, there was no great meeting of the minds on Syria, which is one of the outstanding disagreements. The priorities are just different, and that hasn't been resolved. I would say that the big takeaway from the summit is the medium is the message. The positive benefit that I can point to is the fact that it happened, and more to the point that it's now a regular thing. This is being billed as the second annual U.S. GCC summit, so that from now on, unless the next administration does something fairly dramatic, which would be to cancel this understanding, and I don't anticipate that, there will be an annual heads of state level meeting between GCC leaders, the 6 GCC heads of state, and the American president. And that's an unusual level of, as President Obama put it, institutionalized communication. That builds on the working groups, the strategic dialogue, and a whole framework that's been built up over the past couple of years that was greatly strengthened at Camp David, the first annual summit in May of 2015, and has now been further institutionalized. In other words, it becomes very difficult for, I think, the Gulf states to feel excluded, marginalized, cast aside when they have that kind of regular access to the American president. The other thing is that from a practical point of view, the fundamentals of the relationship are so strong that it's hard to say what, within the realm of what's politically possible in the United States, could be done to increase American engagement. The problem is not American engagement in the region. The military presence is stronger than pre-9/11 levels and historically very high in the absence of a major conflict. Weapons sales and technology transfer have never been higher, really. Diplomatic exchange is very high. American investment is a historical high. Civil society intertrade, all of these things. So the problem is one of optics, of trust, is a political issue rather than a practical one. And so, in a certain sense, there isn't that much that could be done. So the United States is not going to give the absolutely most cutting-edge weapons to the Gulf states because of the qualitative military edge commitment to Israel and some other issues, and the United States is not going to engage in a new treaty relationship with anybody in the world. The American American people are not ready for binding military commitments overseas. They're not just in the Middle East, but generally they feel full up with that. Other than that, then, the question is, how do you deal with this problem of optics and politics and diplomacy? And I think the answer is at that level. And institutionalizing communications, it seems to me, is a pretty good response, especially if it can lay the groundwork for coming closer together on practical policies like Syria, where the next administration is going to have to take a stronger look at lessons learned from the Obama administration. And it's very significant that almost all of the former officials that were involved in shaping Syria policy have been quite critical of the Obama administration's approach in hindsight. So the new administration will take a different view, and it may not delight the Arab world, but it will probably be an improvement.
I said at one point that it was like Arabs were looking for a Goldilocks scenario.
Yeah,
George Bush was too much, this was too little, and they're looking for just right.
Exactly.
Let me switch now to Mohammed bin Salman. He announced recently the Saudi Vision 2030. An extraordinarily ambitious plan. I want to talk about the details of it, but it seems to me to be risky.
Yes.
Risky in the sense that there is a youth bulge. They need to be creating in the range of 300 to 330,000 jobs a year.
Yes.
His previous kings have sought to do that using public sector funds.
Right.
And have done two things. One is made the public sector the job of first resort, not last resort.
That's right.
And they've also, because of the benefits that in particular King Abdullah offered, have created a situation where a culture of private sector employment has been developed, where when we poll in the region and we say, what is your goal? They want a government job because the benefits are better, security is better.
It's seen as a sinecure.
The conditions are better.
That's right.
How do you, with this plan, deal with 330,000 new jobs a year without the public sector being the job creator of first choice?
Well, I mean, I think that's an unanswerable question, frankly. I mean, I don't think there's a simple answer to that. The good news is that there is a public-private aspect to this. In other words, there is a sense in which what's reflected, at least in terms of the ambition,
this creation of a public investment fund that will then
a sovereign wealth fund, which will then drive the promotion of private economic development, private concerns, not just public sector, but private and public-private partnerships as well. So that's the idea. The idea, essentially, though, as I understand it, and I'm not an economist, but my understanding is that the main impulse here is to wean the Saudi economy, in big picture, away from dependency on oil onto a diversified platform that would include a lot of different things, including the public sector. So I don't think it is primarily designed to do what you said, which is necessary. And it's not mainly a jobs promotion program. That's a side benefit if it works. The biggest problems that I can see that concern me is that not only is this incredibly ambitious and therefore, hard to realize. Anything this ambitious is hard to realize anyway. Much less ambitious plans have not been realized in the past. It's been the Saudi government does not have a particularly good record of carrying through on its more ambitious programs. They've seen many different publicly announced plans that have gone by the wayside, been overtaken by events, or that were partially implemented rather than fully implemented. What's going to have to happen here is a sea change, not just at the top, right? I mean, there's clearly an attitudinal shift here with the Deputy Crown Prince that is reflected in this document, in the drive to do it, in the relative sophistication of the approach, et cetera. that's going to have to be reflected much further down the totem pole, shall we say,
There's also
in order for this to be successfully
There's also, in addition to the cultural part of it, there's the economic part, there's a cultural part.
Yes,
there's building theaters.
Right.
The religious police will not look favorably upon that.
No.
There's a whole part of the thing that calls for a complete overhaul of education.
Yes, ultimately.
And a complete change in the way women engage in the workplace.
This is the most important.
These are big issues that are quite ambitious when at the same time you're cutting back subsidies, when you're going to be promoting a private sector as the job of first resort.
Yes.
To make these cultural changes is a very risky thing for a very young guy.
It's extremely risky for him personally. It's risky for the system. It does definitely potentially come head-to-head with the clerisy, and I think it's inevitable. I think you point very astutely to some of the most obvious and most dangerous pitfalls. It is not possible to, although the plan does not really address the full scope of changes on gender relations in Saudi Arabia, the scope of what will be necessary to realize its ambitions, even as laid out, forget about the implications, which are even greater, will require changes that go beyond this. I mean, the simplest thing is, say, women driving. There is no way that you can begin to realize the ambitions of this plan without scrapping the idea that women can't drive themselves to work. I mean, the whole notion of half of the workforce relying on chauffeurs or gender segregated public transportation or something like that is not viable. This plan envisages a completely different set of social relations in Saudi Arabia. You're absolutely right. Some of which is clearly implicit and some of which is more distantly implicit, but could not be, this plan cannot be realized without those things happening. Now, when he has been interviewed, Mohammed bin Salman, the Deputy Crown Prince, who's the author and guiding light of this stuff, when he's been interviewed by The Economist and Bloomberg at length recently, really going into the details, whenever they've asked him about these things, really sensitive questions like gender relations, women driving, cultural issues like the ones you mentioned, theaters and he has said, well, these are, these are cultural issues that are not for me. We'll have to see what the clerisy says, etc. It's coy. It's a politic answer. It's clear that he knows that he has set in motion a process that will unleash all of those forces unless it's stopped.
We're out of time, but I want to thank you for the discussion.
And
I want to suggest that as risky as the Yemen war was, I was thinking of Lyndon Johnson and his hugely ambitious domestic program.
The Great Society.
That ended up getting undercut by Vietnam. This is a similar kind of situation, confronting some local domestic taboos, a huge economic program, meanwhile a war that they've got to end and get out of because it's an economic and political drain on the country. But thanks for helping.
The good news is I think they know the problems they face. The question is, can they fix them? That's the question. But the good news is they know what they are.
Thanks for joining us.
You're
That's
welcome.
all the time we've got for now. For more information, you can check us out on Twitter at AAIUSA or our website, aaiusa.org. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.